In 1984, a man walking through a quiet patch of Belgian forest found a tank that wasn't supposed to be there. No markings on the maps, no reports, just steel dirt and silence. And inside that tank were 4 men who had been missing since 1944, their uniforms still intact, their names long since given up for dead. But what shook us wasn't just the discovery, it was the truth that came with it. A truth no one was prepared to hear. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Rick Callahan. I'm from a small place in southern Illinois, worked logistics for the Army most of my life. But back in 1984, I was just 25, tagging along on a post-tour research trip through the Ardennes with a Belgian friend of mine named Henri Dubois. He'd grown up around those forests, spent years sweeping the soil with his metal detector, looking for war relics, badges, buttons, rusted bayonets. I figured it was just a hobby, something to pass the time. That morning was cool and damp. October light fog, wet leaves sticking to your boots. The kind of quiet you only get in old forests where even the birds hold their breath. Henri had his headphones on, sweeping slow arcs in the clearing just behind his family's old field. I was maybe 50 feet away, leaning against a tree, just listening to the wind. Then I heard the tone change in his machine. Not a ping or chirp, this was deeper. Steady. He knelt down fast, brushing at the ground like he already knew what was there. And I swear to you, he went pale before he even saw a thing, just from the feel of it under the dirt. He looked up and said, "This isn't metal scrap. This is something big." We didn't know it yet, but what we'd found was the final resting place of Captain Martin Granger and his tank crew, 4 Americans who vanished on December 1st, 1944, during the first hours of what would become the Battle of the Bulge. Back then, the Ardennes was called the Quiet Sector, a place where green troops rotated in, where veterans caught their breath. Even the Germans left it mostly alone, or so the map said. Captain Granger was a Detroit boy, mechanical engineer before the war, drove a tank nicknamed Detroit Steel. The men who rode with him, Tommy Reyes, Billy O'Connor, and Jake Morrison, they were the kind of crew that stuck together through hell and back, had their own language, their own jokes, their own rituals. Clean the treads every morning, kiss the locket, say the letter out loud before the hatch closed. That day in late November, everything seemed normal. Routine patrols, radios working. A bit too quiet, maybe, but that was the Ardennes in winter. They were running short on 75mm shells. Marty asked the colonel when the next supply was coming, and the colonel told him to hang tight till December 3rd. Said, "Don't let the quiet fool you. The Germans are still dangerous." Marty nodded. He always did what was asked. But later that night he lingered at headquarters, said something didn't feel right. Dogs barking near the woods. Artillery fire coming from new positions. An old farmer talking about the ground going cold too early. I remember Colonel Harrison saying, "Trust your instincts, son. They've kept you alive this long." The next morning, December 1st, 0800 hours, sharp, Marty rolled out in Detroit Steel with enough rations for 24 hours. They were ordered to advance a few miles closer to the German line, recon only. Standard protocol. He stood tall in the hatch, scanning the horizon like he always did. Frost on the ground, pine shadows like fingers across the snow. At 0847, his voice came through the radio. "Movement observed in grid square 245678. Investigating. Over." That was the last time anyone ever heard from Captain Martin Granger, or his crew, or Detroit Steel, and for 40 years no one knew where they'd gone, until that morning with Henri when the ground started giving up its secrets. I didn't say a word when the recovery team lifted that first piece of track from the soil, just watched the way the light hit it, dull, rusted, still solid. Henry stood about 10 feet back, arms crossed, not moving. He'd called in the authorities the moment he knew what it was, but we both knew before anyone said it out loud. It wasn't just a tank. It was that tank. Detroit steel. And now we had to go back to the last morning anyone saw it alive. Orders had come in at 0800. Captain Granger's crew was to push 3 clicks forward Scout near grid square 245678 and set up short-term observation. Nothing unusual about the assignment. They'd done that kind of recon dozens of times before. Supply was running low on main rounds, but the mission wasn't expected to be heavy combat. Just eyes on the tree line, report any activity and fall back if things looked off. Marty's voice had been clear over the radio. No hesitation. Just, we're going hunting like he'd said 100 times before. The crew prepped in silence. They always did. Reyes checked the batteries on the radios and stowed extras near the commander's seat. O'Connor crawled under the hull to run his final checks on the drive assemblies, wiping oil off his hands as he climbed out. Morrison, the youngest, sat cross-legged by the 75mm, cleaning the barrel like it was ritual. That morning he worked slower than usual. Not lazy. Careful. Granger didn't push him. He just looked once, nodded, and went back to marking alternate fallback routes on the map. They rolled out a little after 0830. Weather was clear, visibility decent, just a touch of fog hugging the low spots. The kind of winter morning that doesn't feel dangerous until it is. Granger rode high in the hatch, scanning ahead, while the rest of the crew braced inside. Their voices came over comms one more time. Status checks, positions, no problems reported. I was on duty at Blue Base back then, coordinating field movement. The last call came in just before 0847. Movement observed in grid square 245678. Investigating. Over. We confirmed receipt, told them to proceed with caution, and that was it. Nothing after that. Just open air and a growing static on the line. We tried again at 0850. Then 0900. Then every 10 minutes for the next hour. Standard protocol. No response. We logged the silence, passed the report up, and kept trying. Other units in the field were already reporting irregular activity. Steel 2 was under light fire near the village line. Steel 4 had called in a damaged track. At first it felt scattered like small skirmishes, nothing we hadn't handled before. But by 0945 it was clear something larger was unfolding. Too many contacts, too fast, too coordinated. Communications started jamming. Some units we couldn't reach at all. By 1000 hours, Colonel Harrison had locked into full combat alert. I still remember the way his voice cut through the comms. Calm. Clipped. All steel units report your position and status immediately. A few rolled in short bursts of updates through the noise. Steel 3 retreating under smoke. Steel 5 rerouting to cover infantry. Steel 7 lost contact after moving toward the western ridge. But nothing from Granger. Nothing from Steel 6. I was the one who logged him missing. You don't think about it at the time, it's just a procedure. Check the box. Mark the grid. Timestamp. But I remember how quiet it was when I typed the words. It felt like something heavy locking into place. Like a gear you can't unturn. The rest of that day was chaos. German forces launched what we now know as the opening wave of Operation Watch on the Rhine, what the world would later call the Battle of the Bulge. 3 armies, over 250,000 troops, tanks, artillery, infantry, all charging through what we thought was a quiet sector. The Ardennes lit up in every direction. Defensive lines shattered in hours. Units folded or scattered. Our positions weren't built for that kind of pressure. They weren't supposed to be. Granger's sector fell into enemy hands by early afternoon. We didn't know what had happened to him or his crew. Some thought maybe they'd been taken. There were rumors of Americans being captured and marched east. Others thought they'd broken south, trying to reach friendly lines through the woods. One report said a Belgian farmer had seen a Sherman rolling through his pasture around noon that day, smoking badly, dragging a broken tread. We sent a recon team to follow up, but they were pushed back by incoming fire. Couldn't confirm a thing. By nightfall, Steel 6 was still missing. In the days that followed, things only got worse. The Germans pressed deeper than anyone thought possible. Communication collapsed. Maps became guesses. The 106th Infantry took massive hits. Civilians fled or disappeared. Whole villages went dark. And through it all, we kept that little square marked 245-678, the last known position of Detroit Steel. We didn't know how bad it was until we started seeing the casualty numbers. 89,000 Americans. Killed, wounded, missing. And in the paperwork mountain that followed, Granger's crew became one more line item in a ledger that no one had time to revisit. The war didn't pause for missing tanks, but some of us didn't forget. Colonel Harrison made it personal. Even as units were pulled back, as the front lines shifted again and again, he kept one folder open. Kept notes. Asked questions. Pushed for reports from locals, anything that might give us something new. By spring of '45, we were getting access to liberated areas. Field teams moved in with metal detectors and manifest lists. Bodies were recovered. Vehicles tagged. Sites cleared. But never that tank. Not a scrap. Not a plate. Not a serial number. Just a name on a missing roster. I got rotated out in late April. Stateside posting. But I stayed in touch with Henri. He kept searching those woods long after the markers had faded and the brass had moved on. He'd inherited the land after his father passed, and something in him wouldn't let it go. He said it felt wrong not knowing, not when the ground still held so many secrets. That's how it was for the next 40 years. Rumors, footnotes, men like Marty Granger fading into a kind of unofficial history talked about at reunions mentioned in half-remembered field logs. Families left without answers, just photographs and the last letters mailed from Belgium. And then, in October 1984, Henri sent me a letter. Said he'd found something near the old river bend where the trees ran tight and the roots twisted up over old trails. Said the signal on his detector wasn't like anything he'd ever picked up before. Heavy. Deep, still buried. I flew to Belgium 6 days later, and when I saw what the dirt had started to give back, I knew exactly what we'd found. But we hadn't opened it yet, not all the way. That came next, and it would tell a different story than anyone expected. They called off the official search sometime in the spring of '47, quietly. No announcement, no press release. Just one more case file moved from active to unresolved, buried in the archives under a long string of serial numbers. I'd already been reassigned by then, back stateside working logistics out of Fort Bliss, but I still had that map grid 245-678 circled in red pencil, the corner folded soft from handling. And every so often I'd get a letter from someone who hadn't stopped asking questions. Colonel Harrison was one of them. He never said much. Just update short notes. A line or two about a report he'd chased down or a new lead that turned out to be nothing. His handwriting got shakier over the years, but his signature stayed the same. Always signed it. Still looking. J.H. For the families, there was no quiet exit. They were left with silence that deepened year after year. Ellen May Rollins. Marty's girl back home kept a framed photo of him on her dresser for decades. She married someone else, eventually had children. But she never took that photo down. When the Army finally mailed her a formal MIA confirmation, she put the envelope in a drawer and left it there. Never opened. Tommy Reyes's mother refused to believe any of it. She kept his room just as he'd left it, bed-made socks folded in the top drawer, a little plastic crucifix still taped to the headboard. On Sundays, she'd sit out front in her lawn chair and tell anyone who passed that her boy was coming home, just wait and see. Billy O'Connor's parents tried something different. They hired a private investigator in '49, a former military officer turned freelance who traveled all the way to Belgium on their dime. He met with farmers, local police war museum curators. Spent weeks retracing patrol routes, sleeping in borrowed rooms, knocking on doors that hadn't seen American uniforms in years. He came back with stories, but no proof. The O'Connors thanked him politely and stopped asking after that. I think they already knew. Jake Morrison's sister held on to a theory longer than anyone. She believed he'd survived, lost his memory somehow, and was living under a new name somewhere in Europe. She clipped newspaper articles about amnesiac soldiers found in hospitals or walking roadsides, sent letters to VA clinics, hospitals, consulates. For a while, I helped her with that, made some calls, wrote a few letters of my own, but it never led anywhere solid. We weren't the only ones. After the war ended, the Quartermaster General's office opened thousands of missing persons cases, and just as quickly began closing them again, some solved, some quietly shelved. Detroit Steel became one more entry in a binder that kept growing heavier. There were reports now and then. A tank spotted deep in the woods, too rusted to move. Scraps of armor found in dried-out creek beds. But whenever a team went out, they'd find nothing. Or worse, they'd find someone else. I still remember a call I got in '58 from a contact in Bastonia. He said they'd found a Sherman tank in poor condition, partially buried visible from the tree line during winter thaw. Said the plate looked like a match. I dropped everything, booked a flight, got there fast. But it wasn't Marty's crew. Different markings, different battalion. The driver had made it out, they said, wounded but alive. That crew got to write their own letters home. Sometimes the search brought false hope that felt worse than the silence. In '63, a group of forestry workers near the German border unearthed a set of remains near a collapsed farmhouse. Uniform scraps matched our unit. A locket was found. For a moment, everyone held their breath. But the locket didn't match Ellen's photo. And the remains belonged to a younger man. Not Granger. Not Reyes. Not any of ours. The news filtered back slow, and each time the families had to brace again. Open the wound. Redress it. Try to close it quietly. In San Antonio, Reyes's younger brother took up the cause in his own way. He wrote letters to local papers trying to keep the memory of Tommy alive, pushed for recognition, for plaques, for something permanent. He showed up to veteran events with a small sign, his brother's name and unit number in black marker on whiteboard. Didn't speak much, just held the sign. People noticed. But nothing moved. The years passed like that. Some people let go. Others held tighter. The war slipped further into textbooks and anniversaries. But in the spaces in between, in the small towns, the side roads, the old attics full of letters, some of us kept remembering. Not because we couldn't move on, but because no one had ever told us what really happened. Henri kept digging. Not literally at first, but he kept the story alive where it mattered. With the locals, with the landowners, with the museum curators who didn't have the manpower to search but were always willing to talk. His father, Philippe, had died by then. But the memory of the tank never left that property. The story passed down with the tools and the boundary lines. Henri took that memory and started piecing it back together, scrap by scrap, clue by clue. By the 1970s, metal detectors had come a long way. Henri learned to tune his by sound alone. He could hear the difference between a bottle cap and an old belt buckle. And still he waited. Watched. Logged soil shifts. Compared satellite photos. Tracked reforestation patterns. He never said he was looking for our tank. He just said, there's still one out there. And then one autumn morning in 1984, he found it. Just outside the bend where the old trail curved downhill. A spot so overgrown it had disappeared into the forest decades ago. The signal was unmistakable. Strong, wide, deep. He didn't dig alone. He called it in first to the local authorities, then to the Ministry of Defense. By the time I got his letter, the area had already been marked off. I flew over within the week. When I arrived, the survey tape was up. White flags marked grid positions. The excavation crew was assembling scaffolding, preparing to go slow. A Belgian military archaeologist named Dr. Marie Vanderberg was on site. Quiet woman, sharp eyes, knew when not to speak. She met me at the edge of the clearing and asked if I'd known the crew. I nodded. She didn't press. Just handed me a clipboard and said, "We're going to take our time." That evening, after most of the crew had gone, I walked the perimeter alone. The forest was quiet, damp. The light was dying slow through the canopy. I knelt near one of the exposed plates, what looked like part of the track housing. My hand rested there for a long time. The metal was cold, and just past the curve of the dirt barely visible in the fading light, I saw the edge of something smooth like the arc of a hatch just beginning to surface. It was still sealed. Whatever was inside hadn't seen air in 40 years. We didn't know what we'd find when we opened it, but we were about to. And none of us, not even me, were prepared for what came next. They brought in generators and floodlights the next morning. The forest didn't get much light to begin with, and the early October fog rolled in so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead without something burning through it. Vanderberg kept the team small. 4 field archaeologists, 2 forensic techs, and a pair of military liaison officers from Brussels. Everything moved slow, deliberate. Every inch of dirt was documented before it shifted. Every rusted fragment lifted like it might crack under the air. I stayed back mostly, took photos, helped mark locations when asked. There wasn't much else I could do except bear witness. By midday, they'd exposed a full length of the starboard track, and the number stamped into the side plate left no doubt. M4A3 Sherman. Hull ID matched U.S. Army records for Detroit Steel assigned to the 712th Tank Battalion. The depression it had settled into, part natural, part crater, had filled over the years with runoff and leaf rot. That, combined with the weight of the vehicle and the overgrowth above, had sealed it like a vault. No animals had gotten in. No scavengers. Just time. The turret had come partially loose at some point, likely from an internal blast. But the hatch was still closed, still locked from inside. Dr. Vanderberg didn't say much when she confirmed it, just asked for the external cameras to be checked again and made a note in her ledger. She gave me a look after that, not sorrow, not warning, just pause, as if to say from here on out it doesn't get easier. It took another 2 days to fully clear the top hatch. When it opened, it didn't creak. It didn't groan. It just lifted like a breath that had waited 40 years. The smell was strange. Not rot, not decay, just old air, fuel oil, rust, paper, something metallic that clung to the throat when you breathed in too deep. I saw the first edge of a canvas bag folded against the back panel, then a boot, then a helmet still resting where it had been set down, and finally the shoulder of a jacket. That was enough. We all stepped back. Identification came quick. Corporal Billy O'Connor confirmed by dog tags and personal effects found in the driver's position. Blood type serial number. Even a small pocket knife his family had described in a letter dated 1943. His body had settled against the corner knees, drawn slightly like he'd braced for something and never had time to move again. There were no signs of panic, no sign of hasty escape. Just stillness. Dr. Vanderberg and her team were good about that. She made it clear early on this wasn't about spectacle. It was about dignity. Every photo was taken with care. Every measurement logged with the kind of patience I hadn't seen in decades. Tommy Reyes was next, found in the gunner's position just behind and below the main breech. His hands still loosely closed around a set of rosary beads, knuckles blackened from oil and time. In his breast pocket they found a small notebook half full, still legible. He'd logged rounds, fired malfunctions heat readings, right up until the last entry, December 1st, 1944. Time marked at 14:23 hours. Then nothing. No final note. No farewell. Just a timestamp. After that blank pages. Jake Morrison's body was pulled from the loader's compartment folded near the ammo racks. He was barely 19 when they'd gone missing. Still had the harmonica tucked in his waistband, the same one his sister said she'd mailed with his last care package. There were scratch marks in the paint near where he'd been sitting, not panicked, not erratic. Just marks, like someone trying to pass the time in silence. And then came Granger. Captain Martin Granger, still seated near the command unit, one arm extended toward the radio panel. The mic was broken. Wires burned out, likely shorted by the heat. But the panel still showed signs of activity. Power indicators had been untoggled, probably cycled several times. The headset cord was fused into the control plate. Around his neck, the locket was still closed, chain still intact, photo sealed and undamaged. He'd kept it on all the way through. His jacket was zipped, his boots laced, everything in its place. The compartment was tight, even tighter with age pressing in. But there were signs, clear signs, that they'd been alive for a while after the initial hit. Rations had been opened. A small tin of water purification tablets was found under the loader's seat. A scarf, likely used to filter air, was tied to a vent port. They'd tried to hold out. But that wasn't the part that stopped everything. The part that no one expected came when one of the techs pulled a second ration tin from behind the navigation panel. It wasn't American. Markings were in German. Underneath it was a field dressing dated December 1944, with a manufacturer's label out of Aachen. Alongside that, a folded cloth with faint red stains, and in the logbook, Reyes had kept a note. Just 3 lines. Written in pencil, not his usual ink. Food from the others. 3 visits. No weapons shown. That was it. 3 visits. No weapons. German-issued supplies. No bullet holes in the crew. No shell impacts beyond the initial damage to the tracks and transmission. The implication, unspoken but unmistakable, was that someone, likely a German patrol, had found them, and chosen not to finish the job. It didn't make sense, not with the orders we knew were in place back then, not with how the SS operated, especially in that sector. But this hadn't been SS. The field dressing didn't match their issue. It matched regular Wehrmacht stock. Line soldiers, possibly medics. There were no journalistic conclusions drawn at that stage, just observations. The food tins were preserved, their contents logged, the handwriting analyzed. Reyes had recorded other things in that same pencil coordinates, terrain notes, directional indicators. Not emotional entries. No sentiment. Just facts. But the pattern was there. First contact likely on day 1. Supplies delivered. Then again on day 2. And a third time before the end. Maybe they hoped someone would come from our side. Maybe they thought the artillery would spare them. Maybe the Germans tried to warn them. We'll never know. I stood outside the tent when they brought the last remains out. The body bags were sealed, labeled, lined up under the tarp where the air was still and the trees didn't move. Vanderberg walked out, handed me a clipboard, and said they'd identified all 4. Confirmed through dental records and personal items. No question anymore. The missing crew of Detroit Steel had been found. But it didn't feel finished, not even close, because none of it explained why they weren't reported, why the field had never been searched properly in 45, why a farmer had claimed to see them and then wasn't believed, or why German supplies had been found inside an American tank left untouched for 40 years. Vanderberg said the physical evidence would tell more in time. Fire damage, entry angle of the shells, footprints if any could be lifted. But for now, she said we had the who and we had the where. The why would take longer. And just before she stepped away, she added one more thing. Quiet. Almost like an afterthought. There's something else. We found a footprint near the hatch, left side, not military issue. Then she walked off. And I just stood there listening to the wind move through trees that hadn't made a sound in days. They photographed the print before the morning fog lifted. One left footheel set deeper than the toe near the tank's open hatch. The ground was soft enough from the overnight dew to hold it clearly, but not enough to tell how fresh it was. Not military issue, that much was clear. Civilian tread. No matching pair found nearby. No indication of approach or departure. Just that one facing the hatch like someone had been standing there looking down. Dr. Vanderberg didn't speculate. She just ordered it logged and flagged, then had the area swept again with finer screens. Nothing else turned up. Not even a partial. We didn't talk about it much that day, but it stayed with me. Not because it meant something right away, but because it didn't make sense. After all the years, the dirt should have settled, should have smoothed over. But there it was. One footprint in a place where no one should have walked. Later that afternoon, they brought out the rest of the internal artifacts, tools, meal tins, empty water cans. One by one, lined out and tagged beneath a field tarp just outside the clearing. The medical supplies, those German field dressings and rations, were sealed in their own container for transport back to Brussels. I stood by as they laid them out, watching Vanderberg's assistant photograph each item under a neutral cloth background. And it was while logging the second tin that he paused, adjusted his gloves, and lifted something wedged beneath it. A piece of paper folded small brittle from time. He handed it off without saying a word. Vanderberg took it, unfolded it carefully, and read in silence. I asked her later what it said. She hesitated, said it wasn't official yet, not translated in full, but she let me see the top line. 4 words written in broken English. We helped. Tell them. I didn't say anything, just nodded. It wasn't enough to explain what had happened, but it shifted the weight of it all. Because somewhere in that window between the tank being struck and the crew dying inside it, someone had not just spared them, but tried to help. And not just that they wanted it known. After the fact, after the war, after the killing. Vanderberg's team didn't assign motive. Their job was physical evidence. But even she admitted there was more to this than remains and recovered shells. The angle of damage, the pattern of scorches inside the crew compartment, the lack of close-range bullet trauma, it all pointed to something unexpected. Not a firefight, not an execution. Something slower, more complicated. There were marks, too, inside the hatch rim. Small ones. 3 parallel scratches. Not deep, not random, like someone had made them deliberately. I recognized the pattern before she said it. That was a signal we used back then. 3 scratches meant safe or sometimes still friendly here. It varied by unit, but Granger would have known it. So would Reyes. Maybe someone scratched it on the hatch to mark a visit. Or maybe they left it when they realized help wasn't coming. Back at the lodging house that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over that footprint, where it was, how it was facing, who might have stood there. Not in 1944, but now. Someone had been there. Recently. And that footprint wasn't pressed into the clearing by accident. It wasn't where a worker would have stood. It wasn't close enough to be from one of us. It had been left positioned like a marker, like someone had come back. Henri didn't sleep much that night either. He knocked on my door just before 2 a.m., holding a folder. Inside were photocopies of a local oral history project he'd worked on back in the late 60s, interviews with villagers from the region. Most of them older farmers, people who'd lived through the occupation and stayed after. He flipped to one in particular. A man named Emile DeWitt, lived 3 kilometers south of where the tank was found. Henri pointed to a translated line near the bottom. I saw a boy in the trees after the battle, American jacket, German boots, stood still as death, wouldn't speak, then vanished. We read it twice, neither of us saying much. The quote was vague. Could have been trauma, could have been confusion. But Henri said something else that I hadn't heard before. After my father died, he said I found his field notebook from the winter of '44. He'd written down sightings, tracks, smoke, mostly livestock notes. But one entry from December 4th said, "Saw a man kneeling by the crater." Not one of ours. I asked him why he hadn't mentioned it earlier. He shrugged like it hadn't felt important at the time. Just a note. But now with everything else, the field, dressing the note under the tin, the footprint, it was hard not to see a pattern forming. Someone had come back here. Maybe more than once. Someone who knew what had happened. Or at least part of it. The next morning, before the excavation resumed, I walked the northern edge of the woods alone. No tape. No markers. Just the line where the trees began to thin and the sun came in stronger. It was quiet. No birds. No engine sounds. And then I saw it just ahead, low to the ground. A tree trunk with a strip of cloth knotted around its base. Faded green. Could have been anything. But it was tied with an old military knot. Not something you see outside a field manual. And it was recent. Not sun-bleached, not mold-softened. I didn't touch it, just stood there letting the weight of it settle. Back at the site, they'd begun preparing for the remains to be formally transferred. Each bag placed in a coffin, each coffin draped and sealed. Flags prepared. Nameplates engraved. The official notifications would be made the following week. But I knew the story wasn't over. Not for the families. Not for Henri. Not for me. Because somewhere out there, someone had carried a piece of this for decades. Someone had made the choice during war, not after, to treat those men in that tank not as enemies, but as human beings. Someone had fed them, dressed their wounds, maybe even tried to stay with them. And then, for reasons we still didn't know, had walked away. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was orders. Maybe they thought the Americans would reach them first. Maybe they came back later and found the tank already gone cold. But one thing was clear now: Detroit steel hadn't been forgotten by everyone. And in the space between a footprint and a note folded under a ration tin, someone had left us a trail. We just had to decide whether we were willing to follow it. I didn't go back to the tank site the next day. The work was nearly done, and Vanderberg's team had moved into the final cataloging phase. They'd packed up most of the loose artifacts and begun readying the remains for formal repatriation. Henri stayed behind to help process the paperwork, but I caught the early train north. There was someone I needed to see, a man whose name had come up twice in the old field journals and once buried in a footnote in an oral history appendix from the local university. His name was Elias Merckx. During the war, he'd been a teenage courier for the Belgian resistance. The record said he was 17 when the Americans came through, just old enough to be trusted with field notes rations and, in rare cases, injured men. After the war, he'd all but disappeared. Lived in isolation outside Namur. No listed phone, no next of kin. But the archives in Liège still had a wartime address logged under his name, scribbled in the margin of a transfer order for humanitarian triage supplies. I followed that. It took most of the morning to reach the edge of the property. A weathered farmhouse sat back from the road, nearly swallowed by trees and fog. The gate was wired shut, but the latch had rusted through and swung freely once I nudged it. No dogs, no motion lights, just a quiet stretch of gravel underfoot. I didn't call out right away. Instead, I stood still watching the front windows. One was cracked open an inch, enough to hear the boots. They weren't mine. They were inside. I knocked. He answered slow. Didn't speak. Just opened the door and looked at me. His face was lined deep but steady. Blue shirt buttoned wrong. Fingers stained like he'd been working with ink or paint. I told him my name. Told him I wasn't military, wasn't press. Just someone looking to understand what had happened in those woods. He didn't ask who sent me. He didn't say my name back. He just stepped aside and let me in. The house was sparse. Old photographs tucked behind glass. One of a train station. One of a boy in an American jacket too large for his frame. The same boy appeared again in a photo near the stove, this time standing beside a man in uniform. U.S. Army Medical Corps patch. No names written. No dates. Just a crease down the center like it had been folded and carried for years. Merck sat down across from me without prompting. No lights on. Just the dim gray of morning filtering through the curtain. I asked about the tank, about the clearing, about the rumor that someone had treated wounded men out there after the ambush. He didn't flinch. He said there'd been a call over the radio. That much was known. A short-range burst that someone local picked up half in English, half garbled. Said 4 alive. Can't move them. Supplies gone. No one acted on it. Not right away. The area was still volatile roadblocks, unpredictable. But 2 nights later, Merck said he was sent by a village contact to check on a location where smoke had been seen. That's where he found them. 3 inside the tank, 1 outside, half dragged behind it like someone had tried to move him to cover and failed. All still breathing. Barely. I didn't interrupt. He spoke plainly. Said he stayed there most of the night. Gave them water. Tried to remove what shrapnel he could. One of them, he couldn't remember the name, kept repeating a number sequence. Not in pain. Just calmly, like a signal. Merckx wrote it down on the inside of a tin lid. Said he still had it somewhere, though he couldn't read the numbers anymore, eyes too far gone. He said the next morning he tried to go back with help. But by the time he returned, they were gone. Tank burned out. No bodies, no wreckage. Just ash and the smell of old fuel. He said it was like the whole thing had been cleared and covered in less than a day. Like it had never been there at all. I asked who he told. He said no one listened. By then, the front had moved east. The villages were being cleared. Too many dead to track every name. The Allies wanted neat endings. Survivors were useful. Ghosts weren't. I asked if he remembered any names. He paused. Said he remembered a patch, Detroit steel, stitched under grime. Said he didn't know what it meant, only that one of the men held onto it like it was a lifeline. Wouldn't let go even when fever set in. That was the same man who left the note, he said. The one under the tin. Merck swore he didn't write it. Said his English was worse than, and besides, he didn't believe in leaving messages where bullets might find them. Before I left, he reached behind a cabinet and pulled out a small rusted tobacco tin. Inside was the lid. Faded numbers scratched into the metal. 17-4-6-12. That was it. No other marks, no initials, just the code. I copied it into my notebook, thanked him. He didn't walk me to the door, just stayed seated, staring past the window where the fog had started to burn off and a single beam of sun cut through. I got the sense he hadn't spoken that much in years. Maybe not since it happened. Back at the station, I called Henri and read him the number. He didn't recognize it immediately. Said it didn't match standard radio tags or troop designations. But he promised to check the archives. Said sometimes numbers were used internally, temporary identifiers for units that had gone off-grid. Field hospitals, listening posts, emergency cache sites. If Detroit Steel had gone dark in that sector, someone would have left a trace, even if it was buried. By the time I reached my hotel, Henri had already left a message. 4 digits, 17-4-6-12, matched the radio tag used for a lost personnel convoy that disappeared near Rochefort in late '44. They were carrying wounded, unmarked, meant to rejoin Division 83 near Bastogne, but never arrived. No wreckage ever found. No names released. Just an internal code and a missing date, December 3rd. The same day Merck said he returned and found nothing left but ashes. I didn't sleep that night either. Not because I was afraid, but because something new had taken hold. For the first time since we'd started, I wasn't sure this was a recovery. It might have been something else entirely. Something placed, removed, replaced again by hands that never stopped moving. Not over decades, not over generations, not even now. I spent most of the following day at the archives in Liège. Henri had flagged the Rochefort convoy in the registry, and we both agreed the designation 17-4-612 was more than just a field code. It had been reused too many times across too many different categories to be coincidental. The tag showed up once in a weather log, once in a casualty dispatch, and then again faintly penciled on the margin of a requisition form for a replacement generator at a forward station that didn't exist on any map. That last entry was dated almost 3 weeks after the convoy had supposedly disappeared. Someone had kept the number alive. I asked the archivist if we could view records tied to unauthorized field hospitals or mobile triage units in that sector. He hesitated, but eventually brought out a small ledger, one of the only ones not digitized yet. It was water-damaged, and parts of it were in French parts in shorthand. But tucked inside was a note on red stationery unsigned. It said plainly, 17-4-6-12 rerouted. Under secondary jurisdiction, see Deschênes. That name hadn't come up before. Henri made the call. Apparently, Colonel Alain Deschênes had once overseen logistics for the Belgian Red Cross during the last years of the war. He was known for coordinating evacuations under questionable authority, often using supply vehicles and unmarked convoys to move both civilians and Allied personnel. Some of those operations had been lauded, others investigated, but none officially condemned. Deschênes died in 1979, but his personal records, letters, logs, and interviews had been donated posthumously to a small war history institute in Ghent. It took most of the evening, but I got access. The collection was stored in long, flat boxes marked AD. I wasn't expecting much, mostly dated correspondence copies of old permits, formal requests. But one folder was labeled Black Branch. Inside, there were only 3 items: a telegram confirming receipt of an unlisted medical transport, an invoice for 27 stretchers never billed to any known hospital, and a photograph. It wasn't much to look at. Black and white overexposed in parts. A forest clearing. 2 trucks partially covered by netting. One man seated beside a gurney writing. Another standing off to the side, face turned. In the center, what looked like a tank hatch open to the sky with a makeshift tarp strung above it. The writing on the back simply said, 13 km-SE of Rochefort Deck 44. Henri leaned in. He said the seated man might be Deschênes himself based on a younger portrait he'd seen earlier. The photo didn't show any wounded men, no faces clearly visible, but the angle of the hatch matched the outline of the tank we'd excavated. That night I called Vanderberg. He didn't answer, but a few minutes later I got a text I found something. Come back. That was it. I caught the earliest train I could reach the site by midday. The perimeter fencing was still up, but most of the crew had been reassigned. Vanderberg was alone in the tent, standing over a fold-out table with an open field report and a handheld UV scanner. He didn't say hello, just handed me a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a strip of cloth canvas roughly 6 inches wide. On the underside, faint but unmistakable, the same number scratched into Merckx's tin, 17-4-6-12. Below it, stitched in red thread, 2 words, Return Void. He said they'd found it beneath the tank, lodged into a crack between the floor plate and what used to be the lower track assembly. It had likely been wedged there during fire damage, almost sealed in place by the pressure. The bag also contained a small clasp copper oxidized and a flattened button stamped DSCO. I asked if that meant Detroit Steel Company. He nodded. Said the button matched a uniform style used by civilian contractors embedded with military units, usually welders, machinists, or munitions handlers, not infantry. Vanderberg turned the UV scanner off and folded his arms. What were they doing out here? He asked. I didn't answer. I think we both knew the question didn't have a neat reply. The tag, the cloth, the convoy code, it was all pointing to something that had been deliberately buried. Not just physically, bureaucratically. Entire segments of these movements had been erased, mislabeled, absorbed into units that didn't officially exist, and yet someone kept the identifiers active. Not for glory, not for recognition, for function. Before I left, I asked Vanderberg if he'd noticed anything else strange, anything missing. He paused, then said yes. There had been 4 identification tags cataloged at the start of the dig, all partial, most unreadable. But after the final transport run, only 3 made it into the chain of custody manifest. The 4th was just gone. No sign of it in the collection tent not listed among the debris. Just missing. Like it had never been logged. I asked if he remembered anything about it. Shape, name, rank, but he shook his head. Said it was too corroded to make out. Could have been anything. Could have been planted. Back at my hotel, I stared at the canvas strip for a long time. Even through the plastic, it felt wrong. Not because it was stained or charred or warped by time, but because of how clean the stitch looked. Return void. Not military phrasing. Not a call sign. It read more like a directive. Not for those who wore it, but for those who might find it. A message aimed forward, not backward. The next morning, Henri called again. He'd found a log entry in a declassified comms transcript dated January 1945, weeks after the tank was supposed to have been destroyed. It was a shortwave dispatch flagged as non-priority delayed relay. The contents were strange. It said, asset location no longer viable. Initiate alternate channel via inland. Use number string to confirm extraction. Sequence 17-4-6-12. The voice tag was scrubbed. No sender listed. Henri asked if I wanted a copy of the file. I said yes, but I didn't know what good it would do. We weren't chasing a mystery anymore. We were pulling at a thread someone had tied off decades ago, and every knot we loosened felt like it had been placed just far enough to stay hidden, just close enough to be found by someone willing to keep asking. I didn't say that out loud. I just thanked him. Hung up and stared again at the number I'd copied into my notebook weeks earlier before I even knew what it meant. I still wasn't sure, but it kept appearing. Not random, not noise. Someone had made sure it echoed. Henri emailed the transmission file just before sunrise. I didn't open it right away. I made coffee, sat by the window, and listened to the city breathe in those early hours. Low traffic murmurs, a dog barking somewhere down Rue Lambermont, the soft rumble of a tram pulling into the depot. It was the first quiet I'd had in weeks. When I finally clicked open the recording, it played back through a filtered tone sweep standard archival treatment to stabilize the old radio frequency. The voice, even degraded, didn't sound like a soldier. No clipped cadence, no procedural language. Just tired, measured, maybe even regretful. He said asset location no longer viable. Repeat location compromised. Begin inland rotation western bend. Respond by sequence string only. Repeat 174612. Confirm status on voided returns. Then static. A long silence. And a second voice barely audible, like it came from a second channel or a bleed in the line. It didn't respond. Just said, understood. That was it. No timestamp, no encryption, no direct chain of command listed. But there was weight in it, like the message had been meant for someone who already knew exactly what it meant. I called Henri. He answered on the first ring. I asked him if the response voice matched any known personnel from the region, or if it could be traced through phonetic markers. He said he'd already tried, ran it through vocal signature mapping, even old Allied radio logs, but nothing came up. It's like the voice didn't exist before that moment, he said. Or after. He didn't sound surprised. The report had been buried in a cluster of old dispatches routed through Bastogne during a period when lines were down and everything was being relayed through backup towers. That meant a lot of junk traffic. Field noise, repetitions. But this one had a manual tag beside it. A notation in ink, different handwriting, filed by request. Retain pending confirmation of burial list. The ink was smudged, but the date matched the same week Deschennes' convoy vanished. I took a train to Bastogne that afternoon. The military museum was quiet off-season, and the archivist was generous once I told him I wasn't writing a book. He brought me to the lower stacks, dehumidified, temperature-controlled, lined with gray cartons and yellowed index cards. I wasn't looking for something explosive, just confirmation that others had known quietly, unofficially, that something had gone off script that winter. It didn't take long. There was a box marked Field Recoveries, 1945, inside a burial inventory labeled Unverified Units. Most names were typed, some crossed out, others penciled in with question marks. But on the back page there were 3 entries without rank, regiment, or date of death. Just single words in the name fields: Marche, Retour, Invalide. I copied them down. On a hunch, I checked for the original source sheet. It had been pulled from a morgue intake log dated January 8, 1945, signed by a provisional field medic, M. Benoit. Not a military doctor, not even a certified nurse. Civilian emergency hire. I asked the archivist if the name meant anything to him. He rubbed his chin and said Benoit had a brother who used to run one of the depot garages after the war. Said some of the men from that unit had stayed nearby, built lives in the shadow of what they couldn't say. I asked for a number. He said the brother passed a few years back but left behind a binder of notes mostly about vehicle repairs and fuel shortages. Nothing useful probably, but it was in the attic upstairs. I asked to see it. There was nothing remarkable at first. Schematics, maintenance orders. But near the end of the binder, tucked behind a loose photograph of a truck convoy lined up at night, I found a small envelope marked only with the words, "For the boy who asks." Inside was a torn page from a notebook. French cursive, hard to read. But once I translated it, the message was clear. They took them west, not for rescue, not for burial. One came back through the woods. Wouldn't speak. Just carved the number into the shed wall and left. We patched him up. No one would claim him. The note wasn't signed, but the initials at the bottom were M.B. I called Henri again. Read him the lines. There was a pause. Then he said, "Then someone survived." I said I wasn't sure that's what it meant. Could be he was never supposed to be part of the unit to begin with. Could be the number meant something different to him than it did to everyone else. Henri said, "That's what I'm afraid of." Then he hung up. That night I went back to the scanned photo from the Deschennes file, the one with the trucks and the hatch. I hadn't noticed before, but in the background behind the netting, behind the shadows, there was a faint mark on the tree line. A square. Tilted. Almost like a window or a hatch cut into the bark itself. Not natural. And beside it, what might have been a figure. Blurred. Facing away. I adjusted the contrast and sharpened the frame. The shape didn't clarify, but the presence was unmistakable. Someone had been watching the photographer from the edge of the woods, and they hadn't stepped forward. I never heard back from Henri after that last call. I left 2 voicemails and an email just checking in, but no reply ever came. I don't think anything happened to him, not in the way people might assume. I think he just reached the end of what he was willing to carry. Sometimes you get too close to something and it won't let you go unless you look away. And sometimes even when you do look away, the shape of it stays with you. Quiet, heavy, unfinished. The photo with the blurred figure in the trees was never officially entered into the record. I didn't submit it for review or try to trace the photographer. I already knew I wouldn't find a name. The trucks in that image were identified by serial as belonging to a supply unit that had been reassigned 2 weeks prior to the last known radio call, which meant either the photo was misdated or the vehicles had been redirected unofficially. Either way, it fit the pattern. Documents just out of sync. People misplaced. Language stripped of names. In the months that followed, I filed my final summary report with the Commission. It was detailed but cautious phrased as a review of archival inconsistencies, not as an accusation. I didn't name the coordinates, didn't cite the hatch or the burial list. I knew it would get filed under inconclusive, maybe cross-referenced in future research, but I also knew it didn't matter anymore, not for them. The truth wasn't going to come in the form of an admission or a headline. It was going to stay where it had always been buried, scattered passed down in margins and footnotes. I kept one copy of the transmission, just the voice. I don't listen to it much, but I did once late one night not long ago. I let it play through headphones while I sat in the dark. The words were the same, but something in the second voice, the one that said understood, sounded different this time. Not resigned, not afraid, just present, like he was there to bear witness. Nothing more. I think about the 3 names scratched onto the burial log. Marsh, Retour, Invalide. Not names, really just directions. Or states of being. Walk, return. Invalid. There's a kind of poetry in that if you're willing to see it. And maybe a warning, too. A few weeks ago, I went back to the place where I first read the file that started all this. Same table, same stack of boxes. But this time, I didn't pull the case. I just sat there a while and listened to the building settle. Papers shifting, a radiator ticking, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, only paused. Maybe some stories don't end in justice. Maybe they just end in memory. In someone finally saying, I believe you. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it. Sometimes that's the only way we make sure no name real or forgotten gets left behind.